You're watching Books Corner on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi. Glad to welcome from Adelaide, Sebastian Strangio. He's the Southeast Asia editor with the Diplomat. More important in this context, of course, he's the author of In the Dragon's Shadow, Southeast Asia and the Chinese Century. Thanks so much for your time, Sebastian.
Thanks for having me, Amitabh.
The title of your book, The China Century, I mean, I know it's in the context of what you were writing, but how would you react to people who call it the Asian century?
Right. Well, I mean, I did use this in the subtitle, as a little bit of a, rhetorical flourish. I don't really mount a cohesive case in the book that this is the Chinese century and that other Asian powers will be excluded from that. But I do think, from the perspective of Southeast Asia, China, the re-emergence of China as a great power after a century and a half of internal disunity and chaos, it is posed the region that its most serious foreign policy challenge of this century. I think that, China will be, it'll be the thorniest, thing that most of these nations have to deal with. And so in that sense, it's very much a century, if not a Chinese century, then a century, sort of defined by that challenge for this region.
And that challenge itself, defining China, I mean, the genesis of your book, of course, goes back to your stint in Cambodia and then your travels, your reporting, your observation in, over 10 countries in ASEAN. With the interesting part about it is, of course, that you're not just looking at recent developments, you're putting it in historical context.
Right. I mean, in order to understand how Southeast Asian governments and peoples view China and are responding to it, you have to understand, earlier patterns of interaction and the sort of residues of that these interactions have left. In every case, we see nations' approach to China, being impacted, sometimes overtly and sometimes more subtly by these earlier patterns of interaction. So take one example, the relationship between the Chinese government, the People's Republic of China, and the ethnic Chinese diaspora communities that exist in Southeast Asia. This is probably one of the most sensitive elements of China's engagement with Southeast Asia. But it's sort of reawakened concerns about the status of these ethnic Chinese communities and perceptions on the part of some ethnic majorities in Southeast Asian countries that they harbor dual loyalties. But this is something that predates the foundation of the PRC in 1949. I mean, this sense of the Chinese, the ethnic Chinese, as fitting awkwardly into the national community is something that dates back to the rise of Chinese nationalism at the end of the 19th and the early 20th centuries, and something that also intersects with the rise of nationalism in each of these countries. And so understanding these patterns, where these countries have come from, how they've interacted with China in the past, is absolutely crucial to understanding how they're responding to its rise today.
And that response itself, when you're talking about Southeast Asia, especially the ASEAN, and the positive of the ASEAN is that it's been able to develop through consensus and possibly, not allow any disputes to get out of hand. But the flip side of that is that it may not be able to show a united front when it comes to challenging what China is doing, say, in the South China Sea.
Right. ASEAN's strengths are the flip side of its weaknesses and vice versa. I mean, the fact that ASEAN has been able to, preserve the peace between its 10 member states, 1967, is itself a fairly significant achievement. Something that in 1967, if you'd ask somebody to bet if that was likely to happen, that there'd be more than 50 years of peace between the members of ASEAN, they probably would have said that you were, crazy if you were looking at the pre-colonial patterns of warfare between these countries and kingdoms. But at the same time, that peace and that achievement has been, achieved through principles of consensus, decision-making, and mutual non-interference, which have been necessary in order to bridge the very, the very divergent interests that these nations have. But as you rightly point out, that need for consensus also imposes sort of limits on how far ASEAN can go in forging a unified position. So you sort of end up with a lowest common denominator consensus on controversial issues like the rise of China.
When you talk about the rise of China, one thing again you can't discount is its proximity to Southeast Asia, and China's not going anywhere. I mean, apart from the geographical status, but in the future as well. The economic linkages that these countries have, tremendous amounts, that it doesn't necessarily allow for a decoupling, even though there's a recognition of the need post-pandemic, especially, and China's aggression, to be so easy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the pandemic has, in some ways, at the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of observers were saying, this is a good example of how, the dangers of being over-reliant on China. That it was no surprise that Thailand, where I was currently living, I was living at the time, was the country that recorded a coronavirus case, the first case outside of China, because of the mesh of transport links and air links between these two regions, the huge movements of people backwards and forwards on a daily basis. But what we've seen, 9 months later is that, China has now effectively contained the spread of the virus within its own country. It's beginning to get its economy off the ground again. While we can never be quite sure about their economic statistics, there's a sense that there's a degree of normality returning in China. And the Chinese government is being very purposeful in sort of telling Southeast Asian countries, we are your ticket out of this mess. We will help you with, vaccines and with the public health stuff, but we're also going to be there to help pull the region out of the economic recession that has been, resulted from it. And so I think that, the COVID pandemic in some ways has re-emphasized the reality of geographic proximity for Southeast Asia. As you rightly point out, that is, the main sort of conditioning characteristic, or the dominant characteristic of Southeast Asia's relationship with China. The fact that it is something that it can't really escape from, and it has to be on good relations with. And what I'm predicting in the months and years to come is that the pandemic, while it's highlighted the need for a balanced diet of trading partners and a sort of a diverse array of international relationships, I think we're going to be seeing China, the coronavirus pandemic reinforcing China's centrality to the region.
While that centrality cannot be disputed, there would be maybe grudge would be too strong a word to be used for those countries, but at least a recognition of China's behavior in terms of how it sees itself as a rightful heir to, I don't know if you want to use the word hegemon in the region, and then subsequently as a world power.
Yeah, I think that's fairly accurate. The Chinese government wants, a lot of Chinese nationalists want what they perceived that they had before the coming of the Western empires. That China was the dominant and central nation in Asia. Now, obviously, the big challenge that they have is that, while China has become the largest economy, it's the most populous nation in the world, and it does dominate the region by virtue of its size and demography, it's also coming up again in a region that is very different to the region that it dominated in the 18th and 19th centuries. I mean, China wasn't the only nation that experienced the contusions of Western imperialism. I mean, Southeast Asian nations, as indeed India, all experienced this, and this gave birth to fierce sense of nationalism in the new nation states that emerged from that experience. And so, all of these, these fierce nationalisms, are something that China didn't have to deal with in the 1700s or 1800s. And so that, Southeast Asian countries are, ever on the alert for a sense of their, national interest or their sovereignty being impinged upon from the outside, whether by China or by any other power. And so I think that China does have these goals, but it's rubbing up against the national interests of numerous states in the region, that, 2 or 3 centuries ago had no real other option but to sort of acquiesce to the reality of Chinese power.
Well, one of those options, though not necessarily enough, could be India. I mean, the foreign policy that we followed used to be called Look East, then it was Act East. But considering the potential of the region, India, you would say, would be punching below its weight?
Yeah, very much so. It's always been a sort of puzzle as to why India is not a more significant player in Southeast Asia. I mean, if you look at the impact that classical Indian civilization had on the region, it was, hugely influential. The written scripts of many of the Southeast Asian nations are derived from Sanskrit models, as much of the languages, the style of temples, all of these things. India left a very deep mark on the region in sort of the classical era. But in modern times, India really hasn't had a huge presence east of the Malacca Strait. And I mean, I'm not a specialist on India, but my perception is that India's strategic attention is consumed by its rivalry with Pakistan, and that it's kind of got a westward orientation as a result of that. And, perhaps the fact that there is this sort of, the eastern hill states are separated from the main body of India by, the chicken's neck. It's very far from the centers of strategic, where most of the strategies get formulated and where, the strategic being directed. But I do think there's a lot of potential there. I mean, India, it's not as big an economy as China's, but it's growing fast. There's a huge amount of opportunity in Southeast Asia in terms of investment. There is an ethnic Indian, diaspora community in the region, not quite as large as the ethnic Chinese communities, but that does, create at least some vestigial connections which can be built upon in order to develop business and trade ties. But I think, I thought that the Modi's government, upgrading Look East to Act East was sort of a recognition that this is something that India really should have a stake in what happens east of the Malacca Strait. But it's still, I think, a case of sort of more words than action at this point. And I think we'll have to wait and see how, New Delhi begins to, lend some more weight to that idea.
Well, there has been more of a recognition now, especially because of what's happened along the border with Tibet, with India in the northern border. So, if not economic, at least military, there is a lot of reporting or talk about, say, the Brahmos supersonic missiles, which India has developed with Russia to ASEAN, whether it's Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines.
I think, yeah.
There's also yesterday, recently our defense minister had a talk with his counterpart in Vietnam, and there is a recognition of some kind of pushback against China with the countries that can do that. How do you see that developing?
Well, I think that, the increasing recognition in New Delhi that China is, a challenge that has to be met proactively. As a result of the standoff in Ladakh, you're beginning to see an awareness there that, a sort of hardening of attitude toward China. Of course, in parallel with the hardening of attitudes in many Western countries as well. And I think that this will probably be the thing that incentivizes a stronger focus on Southeast Asia. Now, I think trade and investment ties can sometimes take a while to develop, but in terms of military engagement, there is a possibility of India taking part in joint exercises east of the Malacca Strait. It's how far they're willing to go, of course, is always the big question, and how far India is willing to how it views the Quad, and how I think that there's still a sense that India doesn't want to be bound into foreign alliances that will constrain its freedom of maneuver, and I think that sort of sense of that non-aligned tradition remains dominant in India. But I think that it's being moderated to some extent by this concern about China, and that could be the pretext for India's a more eastward orientation in its foreign policy.
It wasn't only Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines, etc. that we're talking about in terms of immediate or recent military focus, even Myanmar or Burma, where we've seen India's aware of China looking for access to the Indian Ocean through there is a submarine provided to Myanmar as well from India, of course, vintage one. But so India is looking at those kind of things.
Yes, yeah, I think it's happening. It's happening slowly. I think one of the big problems in terms of relations with Myanmar is simply, integration with India. I mean, you have a sort of a fairly, poor integration of the Eastern Hill states with, the main body of, the subcontinent, and then from there you have these very remote regions, with insurgency, local separatist insurgencies. The transport connections, cross-border connections, are quite poor still, even though there has been a fair bit of development along those lines. I think that, if you look at the rise of Chinese influence in Myanmar over the past 3 decades, it really has been spearheaded by infrastructure and integration, physical integration, highways that run from Yunnan straight into Myanmar. I think that, one of the differences is that the regions abutting the Myanmar border on the Chinese side are beginning to become quite developed and built up, and there's a lot of commerce moving into those regions and hence into Myanmar. Whereas I think that the centers of a lot of Indian economic activity are much further away still. But I think that integration will come with time. Being able to travel by road from Impal to Mandalay once you can do that trip, in a day, I think that will be a game changer. But I think, again, it's going to be a slow process of constructing this infrastructure. And I think that, the Chinese are particularly good at infrastructure, and that's something that, has really, helped them. And it's also true that they've had, in the 90s and early 2000s, they also had the involvement of the ADB in building a lot of these highways. And perhaps the Japanese, I could see that, an important motivation for why the Japanese would want to help out, the integration of Myanmar and India.
When you're talking about infrastructure, one project that keeps resurfacing over the last 200 years actually is what you covered in your book, the Thai Kra Canal, or the Thai Canal, the proposal for that. And we see every now and then there's another new report. We managed to actually cover one of the routes, proposed routes 9A. And you mentioned one of the anecdotes you talk about is Pagdi Tanapura.
Yes.
And I think you describe him perfectly as an owl-like 70-year-old septuagenarian. The Thai Canal, again, is Thailand just balancing itself in terms of, this proposal resurfacing every now and then? Because it would be important if it happened for China.
Yeah, sure. I mean, this, as you say, this is something that's, surfaced periodically, every few years. I think there's been upwards of 20 feasibility studies that have been conducted into this project, and each one of them has been, put on the, back on the shelf. I think that, this is, Thailand's way of sort of saying to China, yeah, sure, we'll consider it, but, there hasn't been any really significant move toward pushing forward with this project. I think there's a number of reasons for that. The first reason is that the potential saving in terms of cost, as an alternative to the Malacca Strait, is relatively small. And when you compare that with the gargantuan construction effort that would be required and the huge cost, tens of billions of dollars to build this thing, it really doesn't make a lot of economic sense. The second thing is that it would create a physical barrier between the separatist South, the predominantly Muslim South, which has been fighting for independence from the rest of Thailand for many years, and the rest of the country. And so it also poses a security dilemma for the Thai government. I think that that this is something that the Thai government said that they were willing to look into, to sort of make the Chinese happy. In 2018, I think it was, that Prime Minister Prayut ordered, fresh feasibility study to be conducted. But I don't have any, I don't see this project being built anytime soon. I think the Thais are very good at sort of, balancing, at saying what they need to kind of keep partners on side. And I think they've actually been very skillful in the way that they've benefited from China's rising power, but also, maintained their sovereignty. And they've been doing it for, hundreds of years. The Thais are very skillful diplomats.
Well, somebody who wasn't a traditional skilled diplomat is Secretary of State Pompeo. How do you see the Biden government you see it ratcheting down at least the verbal tirades or the ideological tirades, but still maintaining pressure against China?
Yeah, I think it's going to be, a shift in atmospherics and in style and presentation, and it's definitely going to have a more diplomatic focus. I think that we're going to see the State Department re-empowered. Career foreign service officers are not going to be leaving in droves as they were under Trump and Pompeo. And I think that, but I do think a corner has been turned in American perceptions of China, which will not be undone. I think that there is a sense that China is a rival. And I think we'll see, a continuation of the Indo-Pacific strategy. I think there might be some tweaks to the focus of that, but I think it makes sense for the U.S. government to push forward with that, to take what was good, or what the Trump administration did that was sort of moving in the right direction, and just make it, try to bring partners on board, less alienating rhetoric. I think we're going to see less overtly ideological rhetoric, even though I think it's very hard for American government, Americans to not view things as a sort of battle of freedom against
good versus evil.
That's a very, it's embedded arguably in sort of the Christian founding of the country, the Protestant founding. I mean, I think those things run very deep in America, but I think we'll see it ratcheted down a little bit. We'll see more moderate rhetoric. Pompeo was really quite, he framed things in unequivocal and stark terms, and I think that was something that didn't go down very well in Southeast Asia. But I think that the similar challenges will remain in Southeast Asia. I mean, this challenge of how you balance values against interests is going to be something that every U.S. administration has faced, and with China's growing power, is only becoming more of a dilemma.
Sebastian Strangio, thank you so much for your insights, and all the best for your book as well.
Thanks, Amitabh. Thanks for having me.
And you can support our kind of journalism by getting onto our website. Do follow us on our social media handles as well, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. You've been watching Books Corner with Sebastian Strangio. I'm Amitabh Revi.